So today we're going to be learning a little bit together about the topic of the Seforno, of Rav Ovadiah's Seforno. We try to understand and appreciate who the commentator is, what they're trying to do. Take a look at some of the examples of what they're trying to do. Be'ezras Hashem. I want to take a moment to thank and welcome Reb Anshel Weiss. It's a beautiful opportunity to have you here, and at the same time we're going to be learning Li'ili Nishmas Chaim in Ben Asher Anshel. That's Rabbi Anshel's father, whose yard side will be Chof Aleph Marcheshon this coming Friday, Be'ezras Hashem, Nishmasai Eden. It's a pleasure to see you here, Mitzvah Hashem. It should be a good year for you, Esther, and the whole Mishpacha, God willing. Let us learn a little Torah. So most people have heard of the Seforno. Some of us dip our feet in the water of the Seforno from time to time, but not everybody necessarily knows and appreciates the background. One of the commentaries on the Seforno, which is one of the go-to commentaries, is actually Rav Kuperman's commentary on the Seforno, which is the typical one just found in the shelves. Actually, my wife went to Michlala, and so she was taught by Rav Kuperman, and she wrote in the introduction. I just looked at her Seforno, which I'm using, and it says, "All I want is that after 120, the Seforno will say to me, Yashar Koyach." And so that's quite an achievement. So he footnotes and then gives a pirush to the Seforno, beautiful writing, Menukad. That's one of the go-to explanations of the Seforno. But let's understand a little bit of the background, who the Seforno is. I thank Moshe for emphasizing that we should do this, because it's easy to gloss over. It's easy. There's so many mefarshim. It's easy to gloss over. Rav Ovadiah Seforno was an Italian commentator of the Torah, and he lived in the 16th century. So he was born in 1475 in Italy, and he ended up in Bologna in Italy. He didn't travel much out of Italy, so at the age of 18, this small town that he was born in, I don't know if it's the correct pronunciation, but Cesena, is actually on the east coast of Italy, not too far away from Bologna, so he really didn't travel too much. At the age of 18, he traveled to Rome because of his great intelligence. He was sent to school. He studied medicine and philosophy and theology, and he spent a lot of time. He was a very, very brilliant student, and through his intellect had the opportunity of meeting many of the greats of the generations, not only Jews, but also non-Jews alike as well. Became very respected in many fields. So much so that he had a relationship with the Pope. He had a relationship with many of the intellectuals of the non-Jewish world as well. So he actually built a relationship with a person by the name of Johannes Reichlin, who was a famous non-Jew. Most people are not aware of this, but if you want to know a little bit more about him, he's what's called one of the Chasidei Umas Ha'olam, who was responsible for averting tremendous tragedy in the Jewish community in Italy and Germany, preventing libels leading to the book burnings, the Talmud burnings in that side of the world. Remember, this has already happened in France. Did not move over to Italy as a function of this person. If you want to hear a little more about him, you take a look at the Tiferes Yisrael, Rav Lifshitz's commentary on Meseches Avos, where he talks about Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, where he talks about how every human being is created by B'Tselem and Akim, and he talks about the Chasidu Umus Ha'olam, and one of the people he talks about is this person called Johannes Reichlin, who saved the Jewish community from many, many troubles. Rav Ovadiah Seforno was, in fact, a friend and a collaborator with him. He had a yedidus with him. The Rav Ovadiah Seforno at the same time was also at the early age writing letters to the Maharam of Padua. Right, so Padua was one of the locations in the European world where Jews were actually allowed to study. Italy was a little further ahead, so the Maharam of Padua was a great seat. The university over there was where many Jews went and received their degrees, many of them becoming doctors. And so he interacted. We have letters between the two of them in the 16th century. We also know that the Seforno met a person by the name of David Rubeni, complicated individual. David Rubeni is also a very colorful character, one of the false messiahs of Jewish history. He obviously, they're all very charismatic, the whole cadre of false messiahs, but he believed that he was trying to convince the Pope to finance an army of Jews to conquer the Muslims on the east and to reconquer the land of Israel. Very complicated character. He had his own. He had a gathering. He had an insigno. He was a very interesting person. He also passed through the the Seforno had dealings with him. Very interesting person. In the end of the day, although he taught and studied Torah, he was also a physician. He was a doctor, and he spent his time traveling and offering his services to many. Ultimately, he settled down in Bologna, and his brother seems to have. He wasn't very financially adept. It doesn't sound like he lived a very financially lucrative or comfortable lifestyle in general. But his brother ultimately underwrote him and allowed him to continue, where he opened up a base ministry and taught Torah for the rest of his life up in the north. And we have this legacy because the teachings that we have are extant. He wrote extensively. The most famous part of what we have is, of course, his commentary on the Torah. But we also have his commentary on Shir HaShirim, on Koheles, on Tehillim, on Megillas Yonah, on Chabakuk and Zechariah. It's worthwhile noting that his commentary on Tehillim, he dedicated to King Henry II of France. He had some sort of relationship there, it sounds like. In addition to when he wrote his Pirush on Eov called Mishpat Tzedek, along with Likutei Shoshanim, and he wrote another two Svarim, one called the Kavanos HaTorah, the ideas or the intent of the Torah, which is essentially a longer introduction to the Torah. And he also wrote a sefer called Or Amim, which was about philosophy from Jewish principles. In fact, he translated into Latin and sent it as a gift to King Henry II of France. He was a very interesting person, obviously interacting with many as well. It's worthwhile noting that many of the copies of the Seforno on the Torah will have his shorter sefer called Kavanos HaTorah at the beginning of the Torah. In it, he divides the Torah. He tries to explain HaKadosh Baruch Hu's agenda, like in this text, in understanding what the Torah is about. And he talks about how you divide the Torah into different sections. It wasn't arbitrary. And he talks about there's ideas, there's with a chelek, what he calls a iyuni, which means to say that the part of the Torah, which is the philosophical point to understand what Hashem is about, what Hashem wants of us. Then there's a chelek ha'ma'asi, what we actually have to be doing. And then there's the sipurim to give us the context of the chelek iyuni and the chelek ma'asi. He goes through all these things. He goes through understanding what karbanos are. And to a large degree, he is explaining the value of the Torah, but he's also explaining it in the context of his feeling that the Jews don't understand the Torah and appreciate its greatness from the attack of academia, philosophy, specifically Greek philosophy, which is still attacking and undermining the pristine nature of the Torah. And he's writing this to show that the Torah is teaching us timeless values, which will clearly make all the philosophy pale in comparison. He spends a lot of time on this particularly, and the Kavanos Torah itself isn't a very long sefer. So just to get with the footnotes over here, it's at the beginning of the Torah. And you can find in most of the things it's only a few pages long. It's really not a long sefer. It's got 16 chapters. It's a very short little introduction to Torah. This is in addition to his Akdama to the Torah itself as well. And you can see I just put a printing of some of on page 2, so some of the different books he had, the works he has. I love the artwork in some of the old versions. In the bottom left, you'll see that says Biur ala Torah, right? And you'll see there's a very interesting image there of with sort of this lion with eagle's wings. This eagle over here, which has a tail. But and there he says, Beli hashpas tov mazalois ma'at mo'ilois. Sorry, that's on the left side. Ma'at mo'ilois hamuskalois, some value of the intellectual ideas. Beli hashpas tov mazalos, without the astrology, without external ideas. He believes that MS is found when looking through the Torah itself. That's where you find it expands outwards without the need of philosophy at the same time. It is interesting that when he writes his Pirush on the Torah, he explains why he's writing it. And so he has a shorter introduction where... So what was that?
Sounds like he's saying the opposite.
Which one?
When he says, Kol Beli Hashpos, Tov Mazalos, Ma'at Mu'ilas Ashkalos. And if I don't have a little bit of mazel, all the intellect's not going to help me.
Interesting.
He's like, they're flipping.
Interesting. So it depends, I guess, which way you read it.
Maybe he's put it that way so you can read it both ways.
Maybe you read it both ways. It's a very good question. And it's also not clear if that was the printer. Right. Or the author.
I hope it was the printer who called him Arofim, and that he wrote that himself.
Yeah. You have to. It's a good point. Yeah. And by the way, most people do not notice that as actually is that he primarily viewed himself as a physician, like the Rambam, right? Like the Ramban too, were physicians. That was their predominant work, the predominant, we'll call it position. You're right. Notice, by the way, that's printed in Venice. This is an earlier printing than the one on the right, which was in Warsaw, when the printing presses moved to Eastern Europe. Italy was a seat of a very significant amount of Judaism and its teachings. Listen to what he has to say about his introduction to the Torah itself. When he's not the Kavanas of the Torah, but in his introduction to the Torah, he explains why he's writing his book. He says, "Ani hatzair Ovadia, I, the young man Ovadia." He says, Ben, and he goes and he quotes beautiful appellations about his father, Yaakov Seforno, Zichor Livrocha L'chaye Olam Haba, L'kol Divrei Chananel Achi, that he's now quoting his brother Chananel. This is the person who's supporting him. Asher bekinoi is kinas el bono shel Torah mibonim loy emun bom noistim tam lifgam b'seichel milea siporea v'sidora. So he says that my brother was very concerned about the fact that people were despising, contradicting, questioning the Torah, its order. He's very into order of the Torah. B'shegam hi segula she'sichla shekula machmadim nechochim l'mevin ve'en omer hashev. And the Torah is this beautiful treasure where there's no questions that should be asked about it. Yair bi ozen, my brother therefore spoke to me and said, Limtso divrei chefetz magid meisharim umarim meirim michshol ad yetzei kenogat tzidka. So he wanted somebody to be the champion of the Torah, to explain why it's so valuable, why it's so beautiful, why it's so necessary. Oz amarti asapra ma shemetz dvar motzo yadi b'mechuvan ba haloi mitzar hameshuar etzli yair Berabim v'nichbadim loseis imrei shefer v'zichron b'sefer yagdil Torah v'yadir. So I said, I'll put my small hand into this, and I'll put my gauntlet onto the table to try to explain a little bit of the beauty of the Torah. Yomnam tirdas umekori mikrei azman yalde yom savivim ki devarim. He says, look, there's so much, I've got so many pressures, and there's so many things that are taking my time, which disallow me to do this. There's so little time to spend gazing at the wonders of our Torah and skipping. He says, "Lifamim ma'amar rishonim bilti mevu'ar pa'amim teshuva bilti maspekes v'la'atir ha'safek v'tihi lecherfas lamoy." Because sometimes there won't be sufficient answers among the earlier commentators of the Torah, and then people, when looking for questions, will not find the answers. So I feel that there's a little bit of a gap over here, because not everybody's seeing the great value of the Torah. So he says, but I don't know what I'm going to say when I get to the Shemayim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to demand the El Bono Shel Torah, and is going to say, how could people sit around while people criticized and didn't understand the value of the Torah? He says, what am I going to answer? So I feel I have the responsibility to do this as well. It's interesting, actually, in this translation, in this section over here, just skip the first paragraph, which is, why is this the circumstance? Why are Israel in such a circumstance? He says, because me'az galu barosh galim mevualim uduchufim megoy el goy. So he points out that the nation of Israel are, being washed up from every nation on every shore. They don't have the ability to think. They don't have the ability to reflect, because they're just surviving. They're just subsisting. And therefore he says, that's what I'm addressing. Obviously this is very relevant, because here you're talking about an Italian Jew who's reflecting in the 1500s about a very significant part of the Jewish community that is now being dislocated, which is the Spanish Jewry, right? So that's clearly what he's saying over here, and he's saying in that void there's been an intellectual desolation which has followed, and I feel like I need to address this. Notice, based on this idea, he is going to give a pirush which is really completely the opposite to the Abarbanel. So we spent a little bit of time last week on the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel has extensive essays on every topic. But remember, who's the target audience of the Seforno? He says the people who don't have enough time, who don't have time to think and reflect on insight, who are being buffeted from the outside by questions academically about what the Torah is about. And maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe the order isn't. So he says, I'm going to make it easy. And so the Seforno doesn't have long questions, doesn't have long answers. It's clear, it's incandescent, It's not. There's no detours. It's not. It's a very simple. It's very accessible, and that's the point. Is because his audience are those who need access to understand the Torah. He's too succinct sometimes, but the truth is that he's more verbose than, let's say, a Rashi, Rashbam, or Ibn Ezra. But he's certainly not. He does not go into the lengths of the Ramban, and certainly not the Abarbanel. And the Seforno himself has this very, very beautiful medium, and that reflects the fact that his audience are those he wants to influence as well. It is interesting that although he is moving away from Greek philosophy, something which does impact the Seforno very much is the rise of humanism, which is part of the Renaissance movement, which of course is very much, Italy is very much the center of a lot of this thought as it spreads to the rest of Europe. And humanism places a great emphasis on the value of humankind, on the value of the human being. And this, in fact, is something which affects and impacts the Seforno himself. It's a value which, what he does is he takes this value of humanism, the value of the human being, and humanist thought, going all the way back to Cicero, but actually, interestingly enough, with a Jewish flavor about, we'll call it, the value of the human being. Now, just as a few examples where he understands and he looks at it from this perspective, this is sort of a, we'll call it, this is a very moving into the future type of philosophy over here. So as an example, when it talks about the Tselem Elokim, the human being is born with the Tselem Elokim, does a non-Jew have Tselem Elokim? Well, the Torah seems to say so, because humanity was created with the Tselem Elokim. The Mishnah Avos says, Chaviv Adam Shnivra B'Tselem. Adam refers to all of humanity. That's what Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah. And so what is that Tselem Elokim? What is it that every human being is endowed with? Says the Seforno, that refers to the human intellect. The human intellect which is not specifically attached to any organ or any part of the human body, which therefore is above the, we'll call it, specific biology of the human being, which is why the human spirit that will live on beyond death, because you can kill the body, but you can't kill the soul, which is intertwined with that body, even though it doesn't have the seat in one place. It is interesting. It's very interesting. I've just actually picked up a book. I don't have time for this, but I just happened to notice it in my shelf from a number of years ago, called Descartes' Error. And it's actually written by a neurologist in the University of Southern California, about trying to link all thought processes, emotion, with specific seats in the brain. Meaning to say, it starts off with an incident that happened a century and a half ago. About a century and a bit ago, about a fellow in Vermont who was busy making the was a foreman making the railways, and they would blast through the mountains, and the way they would do is they'd drill a hole in the rock, they'd put the gunpowder into the rock, they'd cover it with sand, they'd tamp it down with sand, and then they'd blast the blast out of the way to create the space for the railways. He unfortunately was distracted, and when he was tamping it down, he tamped down the gunpowder, and the beam went through his head. Right, so it shot through his head and at 100 feet beyond him, and he lived. Right, so it went through his head, and he and we're talking about something that's almost a 3-inch diameter, went through his jaw and out the back of his head, and it was an interesting case because he continued to live, but he became a different person after he healed. Right, so his emotional temperament changed, his etiquette changed. But he was a healthy physical being, and he had all his faculties and senses, but he changed. So that became the research as to what parts of the brain do what, right? The Seforno is not into that philosophy. The Seforno believes that the soul, the intellect, is not pinned to a specific part of the human being. It's a larger endowment of God which is intertwined into the body itself. This debate, by the way, itself about understanding the nature of the soul is something which will go much later on. When Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein, it's the same question that's being asked. She's also among the Romantic poets who's asking the same question: is can you find the soul which is not on the dissecting table, which is what's happening as the Romantic period is ascending. Really, really fascinating debate. The Seforno is of the notion this is not something that you can specifically find with an electrode, right? The soul is something beyond that as well, which means to say is that all of humanity is endowed with something spiritual beyond the capacity of a specific biological function. So therefore you say, well, what's his view on the non-Jewish world? It's actually very favorable. So as an example, here's the first really to introduce this notion of when, let's say, the mitzvah of ribis, right? So the mitzvah of ribis is la'achicha al tashech. Don't seek out or bite, so to speak, with interest your brother. And he makes the point that contractually, money is worth time. That's just how it works, right? The only reason I'll lend you money is because I can make money with that money, right? So therefore, contractually, I make when I have to lend out money, I'm going to take money for the time because the time is value. That is the default. The chidush of the Torah is don't do it to a Jew because he's achicha, meaning, but the default is, of course, you take interest from a non-Jew, which means to say is that the Torah is not saying punish the non-Jew, it's saying be contractually respectful of the we'll call the default interaction of how you lend money, which is with interest. But to your brother, the Torah waives that, which is he's the first one to sort of frame it that way, not as we'll call it as the non-Jews being bad and the Jews being all right, but rather the non-Jews being regular. That's how it works in terms of our financial interactions with them, but the Jew having a special right. Similarly, later on, when the Torah not later on, but when the Torah tells us, famously in Parshas Yisro, "Vatem tiyuli mamalech es kohanim v'goy kadosh," you're going to be a holy nation. What does this Torah explain? "Vatem tiyuli mamalech es kohanim," in source 8, "Uvazeh tiyu segula mikulam," you're going to be the treasure among all of them. "Ki tiyu mamalech es kohanim la'avin u'la'rois lechol hamin ha'enoshin likra kulam b'shem Hashem," you are going to enable the rest of the world to call out in the name of God. And he believed in that because he translated his works into Latin and dedicated them to Henry II of France. Meaning he lived this, right? He believed that there was value in the non-Jews arriving at truth. Through whom? Through Mamleches Kohanim. Right? So this very broader humanist view of with the uniqueness of our relationship, our spaceness is something which comes out throughout his works. Now, we take a lot of this for granted. This is not necessarily the accepted norm, necessarily in milieu that he was living. So this is something which is unique about his pirush. Other aspects of this is there are a number of times where he'll identify we'll call basic ethical principles. I have to thank Dr. Abigail Ruck for really a lot of really very, very fascinating Makoros. Among the Seforno, I went through a lot of the places I've cited the Seforno. I went through a lot of different places with just so many beautiful things. A lot of times you'll talk about the universal ethics, just basic things that we should be doing. And he'll say this is at play here. He has a few examples. So for instance, when it comes to Yaakov Avinu, right? Yaakov Avinu arrives at the Be'er and he sees the shepherds and they're not doing anything. And he doesn't understand that yet they can't uncover the well because there's not enough people. So he says, like, go out, you're a shepherd, you're being paid for your time, go out and do your work. Says the Seforno, hatzadik yimas es ha'avel, gam kain el ha'acherim ka'amroi, to'avas tzadikim ish avel. He says, righteous people cannot stand by when injustice is happening. You might ask yourself, what business is it to you, Yaakov Avinu? Go find another well. Why are you talking to these people? Maybe they're going to raise an arm against you because you're reprimanding them. No, but Yaakov cannot stand by while these people are on paid time as employees and they're simply not doing their thing. They're at the coffee station and they're spreading rumors about management. That's not the way to do things. No, we have to be working right now. That's what Yaakov Avinu says. So I mean, say this is not a Jewish value. This is a universal value. Tzaddik cannot stand such things. Similar to Avraham Avinu about what's happening to Sodom, right? We just cannot sit by as this happens. Similarly, another example is this is a really interesting example where it says that Yosef has his brothers. They come down to Mitzrayim, and it says Vayichakel Yosef es Aviv es Echav es Kol beis Aviv elechem lefi ataf. Enough bread for the children. So what's the question? This is a really interesting question for anybody who's ever been involved in government, right? The greatest thing that happens, I mean, not the greatest, but the most common thing that happens to anybody who arrives in a seat of power, which has therefore the power of favor and the power of special programs and special permissions, they get lots of friends, right? Lots of people become very friendly with them suddenly. We want variances, right? We want all the things we want from people in power, and he in this case, you would expect that the greatest thing that happens is what's called nepotism, right? Friends and family, they get first, they get bigger, they get more. And he says, no. He says, lechem lefi ataf. He says, wait a second, says the Seforno, there's a famine happening. The world is in a place of distress. So Yosef is not going to give his family extra when there's distress outside. It's a difficult time, right? That's a moral imperative. It's not appropriate to be giving more to your family when there are other people outside are not eating. Again, another of these we'll call ethical values, which seems to inform the way that he says it as well. An interesting observation, which I'm sure we've all come across, but it's an interesting thing, is who is Edom? Who is Edom in just in the Torah? It's Esau, right? It says Esau who Edom. The Torah tells us this is the end of Vayishlach. But why is he called Edom? I mean, that's like a funny name. So we know that's because at the beginning of Parshas Toldos, it's first of all he's born red, but I dare say actually it's interesting that it's more actually relates not to his genetic makeup, but more actually his action cycle. Because we see at the beginning of Toldos, he comes over to Yaakov and he says, give me from this red stuff, right? So and which is strange because that's like seems to be a very tangential phrase that he says in his life to warrant him a lifetime worth of being the red man, right? So why is that? So Seforno says, because when you are a person who's not in control of yourself, when you're a person who's lahut achar ta'ava, when you just you can't act more than an animal, then you lose your ability to have distinction and articulation, which means what he should have said is, Yaakov, please, wouldn't you mind giving me a little bit of lentil soup? But when you're the kind of person who's just running after the latest thing that appears to you, you don't even have the ability to articulate. You just say red stuff, right? Details disappear as you move into the realm of just we'll call it running on that rat wheel. And that's what happened to Edom. So Edom, in fact, is a description of the type of person he is. He's lost detail. And you see this a lot of times when people get too much, right? They just oversatiated themselves. They lose the appreciation of subtlety. They lose the appreciation of detail. They lose the appreciation. That's what the Seforno is saying over here, right? So that's not a good thing. We don't want to be named Edom. We want to be named a person, Tam. Yaakov's Ish Tam, right? Naive, simple, pure, right? It's the opposite now, essentially, to Edom. Really, very interesting observation to the human condition. It is worthwhile noting that a lot of times the Seforno is speaking to a Jewish world which is very much depressed. He's speaking to a Jewish world. There's an overflow of refugees in every Jewish country. One can imagine this point in time. Again, it'd be interesting to go into foreign policy of all the states of Europe and see which ones closed their doors and which ones didn't. The Ottoman Empire opened its doors. They realized the economic boon from having the overflow of Spanish Jewry. I'd be interested to see which countries did or didn't accept Jewry at this time. The overflow of over 300,000 Jews from Spain. We're talking to a very difficult time. People are very struggling as well. And he relates to this. He relates to this. It informs his pirush. And this is very important to appreciate in general, is the Mefarshim will speak from their perspective. They'll speak from the perspective of the life they live. That doesn't belittle, rather that elevates, which means, say, sometimes you'll hear an academic saying, oh, and especially when we get to Rav Hirsch, the Malbim, the Netziv, the Ksava Kabbalah, Be'ezras Hashem, as we move into the 19th century soon, we're going to see that a lot of them are responding to attacks from reform, higher criticism. There's a lot of things. And sometimes people will belittle this and say, oh, you see, it's just polemics, right? No. It's exactly the opposite. The Torah is a pregnant text with infinite levels of meaning. And each of those levels of meaning are waiting to be understood based on the concerns of the time. Which means to say, is we will go through certain experiences which will allow us appreciation of that angle of it. Similarly, in the last year, where we've seen ways of appreciating the Torah through we'll call post-October 7th reading. Tehillim has never been the same. The Torah reading has not been the same in the last year cycle. But that's not because it's belittled, it's because we had refreshed eyes to appreciate the uniqueness of the Torah in that respect. So the Seforno is doing that in the shadow of Spanish expulsion as well. So just a few examples as well. When he looks at the Migdal Bavel, in the 11th chapter of Bereshis, and he talks about this idea of this empire building this tower, Migdal Rosh Hashemayma. He talks about, and you can obviously just sort of now just sort of close your eyes and listen and hear what he thinks about Christianity as a whole, the danger of it. In source 15, he talks about Migdal Rosh Hashemayma Na'aseh Lanu Shem. He says, Na'aseh Shem Avodah Zarah Shetiyeh BeMigdal, they're going to put a pagan deity in this tower. V'yatsa b'chol hamina inashi shem goiva mekayma v'goydel ira ba'ofen shetechoshev Elohei ha'Elohim. They want it to be that they are the God of gods, this tower, which is going to now superimpose itself on the entire humanity. He wants everybody to be seeking out, to be identifying to, and being submissive to this nation. And that's why Hashem says, in the next pasuk, what does it mean? He says, Im Kain, in source 17, this pagan worship is perhaps going to succeed. Therefore, they're going to no longer be able to have access to believe in the monotheism of God. And he is the creator of all of so what does Hashem do? Hashem allows them to fight among each other, so there's not going to be one dominant group that is going to superimpose its reality across the world. Remember, at this point in time, the Christianity is ascendant, right? The Iberian Peninsula has been cleansed of non-Christians. There's this thought of even now a fourth crusade towards Jerusalem. The papacy is at its highest. This is before the Reformation, so this is before the church splits at this point in time. So this is sort of the danger he is identifying at the same time, which is interesting because he relates to the non-Jewish world. He's scared of the sort of Christianity dominating that conversation, and it's a very intolerant domination at this point in time. Similarly, you see ideas like when it talks about how Esav goes in Parshas Vayishlach, or Esav sees Yaakov and he runs up to him and he kisses him and he hugs him, the whole business. So what's happening over there? It's interesting to note the differences between the Mefarshim. So as an example, reverse 3 centuries to the Ramban. The Ramban says, this whole section here, it says, the Ramban in source 19, Al dati kam ze yirmoza ki anachnu hisalchnu lifni filoseinu biyad edom ki malchai ba'ez sheni bo bebris im aromayim umehem shebo beroma v'hi yisa sibas nefilosam biyadam. Says the Ramban, when examining Parshas Vayishlach, when we start sending too many gifts, like Yaakov Avinu did to Esav, when we start cuddling up and thinking that we're going to find respite by negotiation and diplomacy and foreign officers, he says that was the beginning of the fall of the Jewish people. And he says, read the book of Maccabees and how much they had felt that they needed to play nice with Rome, and that ended up not so nice. Right, so the Ramban says that's not the way to do things. This form of submission is not good. Whereas look at the Seforno. The Seforno says a little bit differently. He says, "Vayoretz Esav ne'pach liboy kamoy rega ba'ach na'asav shel Yaakov." The submissiveness of Yaakov, says the Seforno, was what allowed Esav to turn around and not exercise power without restraint. Kinyanenu begalus, like our exile. In Bnei Esav, with and referring to obviously Christianity, and he says, therefore, we know from Yaakov Avinu's actions that it is best to be submissive. When you know who's in power, you have to pay homage to who's in power. Now, notice, by the way, the difference between the Ramban and the Seforno. Also note that the difference between the Ramban's interaction with Christianity and the Seforno's interaction with Christianity. The Ramban was very unapologetic to Christianity, and as a function, he had to flee because he published the transcript of his debate with Pablo Cristiani, and he was, we'll call, unbending. The Seforno says that the Torah is giving us the formula of how to deal with Esav when Esav is in power, which is submission and flattery and all the things that they need to hear about themselves, because that's the only reason we're going to survive when we have that interaction with them. Notice, by the way, just trying to struggle as a diaspora Jew with a power which is beyond oneself as well.
Rashi almost has a precursor to both Shatan. One he says Esav Bairim, and the other
yes, very good, and straddling both, right? By the way, both of them are midrashic lines. The question is, what do you emphasize based on the reality that you're trying to navigate, right, and trying to understand? Similarly, again, this is just a very famous idea, but I don't think most people are aware this comes from the Seforno, and that is when it's describing that the nation of Israel will be like Afar Haaretz. So usually we hear about dust and stars, right? And both of them are seen as an expression of multitude, lots of Jews. It's a blessing. The Seforno has a slightly nuanced perspective over here. He says a sad thing. He says in source 22, Achar sheyiyeh zaracha kafar aretz, kinyan v'tasimeni ke'eretz gayecha v'kachutz la'ovdim. What it says, v'zeh sheyeh b'tachlis hashiflus. What does it mean like dust? It means that which is you trample on. The Jews will be like a trampled on existent. As tifrotz ba'aretz asher ata shochev alea b'chol tzad yama v'kemet tzavona v'negba. Ki amnam teshuas hakel la'asida tiyeh acharav shiflus Yisrael. Meaning, you will be scattered as part of the diaspora like the sand which people trample on, and then Hashem will save you. Which means so this resolution comes after the shiflus as well. So we usually think is Afara Aretz, wow, so much, you can't count the sand. Yeah, you can't count the sand, but they're also the lowest of the low. And he's reflecting on very much what he is seeing in the reality around him as well. But he does speak, and even in realizing that there is so much of difficulty around him, he does talk to the notion of Yeshua, of Mashiach. And so, for instance, when it describes how Yosef is pulled out of the bor, he transcribes this, he scales this outwards as the resolution of jury, and he says in the 24th source, Vayiritzu min habar, Yosef is pulled out of the pit, Kederech kol teshuas Hashem, like all salvations of God, Shena says, K'moy rega, it can happen in any moment. K'amroi ki krova Yeshuasi lavoi, u'k'amroi lu ami shameali, right? V'kimat oivei machni, Hashem is about to make their nation, their enemies submit. V'kach hayam Mitzrayim, K'amroi ki garshu Mitzrayim, k'amram zal shelo yispik b'tzeikon shelo v'senu lachmis, and that's why we left so fast, our bread didn't rise. V'chein amar la'asois, v'chein amar la'asois la'asid. And that's what's going to be in the future as well. You can imagine the average Jewish reader learning the Torah at this point in time is now reading about Yosef in the pit, and suddenly how, boom, in one moment, everything changed, and he says the same thing can happen to us. That's what we mean, is in B'chol Yom Achak Eloi, is that the capacity of change is within reach any moment, and we see this even in the Yosef situation. So very much talking to the state of Jewry in the world, at the same time as the resolution of Jewry at the same time. So notice over here, not just understanding the psukim, but understanding the psukim as it pertains to us. And by the way, it's still very much a reality that we deal with. There is no logical resolution in the Middle East, folks. I don't know if anybody's arrived at that conclusion yet. Nothing is going to change logically. We need Vayiritzu min habar, because the way forward is very dark. He does have a very interesting way of looking at the perspective of tzaddikim. This is a theme that he follows in general, and that is that he gives tremendous deference, tremendous kavod to the greats of our nation. We will see that others will not necessarily agree. So, for instance, we will see from the perspective of Rav Hirsch later on, Rav Hirsch is willing to entertain that there may have been mistakes made by the greats, and that perhaps makes it easier for us to relate to them. We will see some examples of that. The Torah does not go in that direction whatsoever, and it's important to appreciate the subtlety of this as well. So, for instance, let's take an example. This is a very famous example. It says that Sarai in Parshas Lech Lecha is unable to mother a child. She suggests surrogacy. In those days, surrogacy is not available in the medical way we have it today, but what does she do? She suggests Avram marry Hagar. Hagar ulai boneh mimeno. I'm going to build from her. Hagar becomes pregnant. As she conceives, she becomes arrogant, and Sarai vataneh. She afflicts Hagar. Hagar runs away the first time in Parshas Lech Lecha. The Ramban says very famously, in a very sharp and terrifying comment, that the Ramban says in source 26, he says, Chata imenu bi'inui hazeh. This is an example where a Mefarish will say this was wrongdoing. Sarah was not correct in afflicting Hagar. There are other ways of managing this situation. Avram did not interrupt Sarah. He gave her to Sarai. Hashem heard her calling out in affliction. And gave her a child. Sheyeh Pere Adam, who's going to be a wild, unregulated character. La Nois Zera Avraham V'Sara B'Chol Mina He'inu. He is going to continually afflict the nation of Israel. And why is that? Not blaming the victim here, but understanding that we'll call the genetic predisposition over here comes from that original Inui in utero of that child called Yishmael, and his name is Yishmael. Hashem is going to listen to him because of that pain that was afflicted, which means to say is that the Ramban is drawing us back all the way to the very pregnancy of the Arab state. Essentially, that's a very, very terrifying comment. Whereas, notice that is criticizing Sarah Imenu, says the Seforno under no circumstances. How could you criticize this idea? Says the Seforno, no. Vatanya Sarah, Kadesh Takir Shi Mishuberes, Veloy Tivaze Odes Gvirta. Well, like, there has to be rules. There has to be consequences. You can't just the kids are all talking throughout class. It's all right, everybody. You just carry on. Germinating a thoughtful conversation. No, that's not. That's not all right. There has to be consequences, right? So the point is that there has to be expectations. And so she was very much within her realm as a mistress to demand such as well. Similarly, in the parsha we just read, Vayera, it says, "Vatitzchak tzara b'kirba leimor." She laughs upon hearing about the heralding of a child. So it sounds like, from the way the Torah describes, it sounds like from the fact that Hashem reprimands Avram that this was wrongdoing. However, says the Seforno, why did she? What led her to this as well? So he says very famously, "Vatitzchak tzara." Shechashva shehi devar malach birkas navi bilvad kinyan elisha lo nevuah v'shlichus hakel yisparach. Listen, there's 3 Arabs outside, right, on a very hot day after Avraham Avinu is recovering from his medical procedure, right? So, and how is she supposed to know? Okay, they're giving her a tiding of a child. Okay, so maybe it's a navi, maybe some sort of divinely inspired individual, but that doesn't guarantee anything. So she's like, yeah, I'm not, 89 years old. Right now, at this point, 90 years old in my life, I'm going to have a child at this point in time. She says, I'm beyond a prophecy to be saved. This cannot be affected by simply a navi or a malach. This has to be beyond. This is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So she didn't realize this was directly from Hashem, which is why she laughed. Now, HaKadosh Baruch Hu reprimands her, but the point is, from her perspective, this wasn't doubting Hashem. This was doubting the messenger, if this was really a messenger. Again, doing the same thing over here. The most famous, and we'll close with this, the most famous example of where the Seforno does this is something which informs the entire destiny of all of Klal Yisrael, which is when it comes to the sale of the brothers. We already saw an interesting observation when we spent a few weeks ago looking at the Rashbam and his unique perspective of the fact that the Rashbam understands the brothers did not sell Yosef, right? They put him in a pit, and there was the Midanim and the Yishmanim, 2 groups of people. The Midanim pulled him out, and the Midanim sold him, right? Sold him. But if you go through the pronouns in the pasuk, that's the way the Rashbam says it. So the brothers facilitated the situation, but they did not do the situation. I just happened to come across yesterday at Shuvas Mari Lublin, I was going through the halachas of tshuva yesterday, just in the Shulchan Aruch, and he talks about a situation where a person sends another person to do a shlichus. He goes and he says, go buy something, get something, deliver something in another city, and the person's killed on the way. How much responsibility, how much culpability in terms of tshuva is that person responsible for, because they facilitated that? So the brothers, that's what the Rashbam understands. The Rashbam is that he facilitated the sale, which happened, was not theirs. The Seforno says no, they sold him, and they wanted to kill him. But they were right? So you say, what does it mean they were right? So it actually goes back to an original, going back to the times of in Parshas Vayetze, where it describes how there were 12 stones around the head of Yaakov. In the morning it says there was Evan, 1 stone, and the Medrash famously says, Rashi quotes this, that the stones were vying to be under the head of Yaakov. The Seforno transcribes that as saying that, listen, there's going to be one ideology which is going to dominate and is going to be we'll call the leading ideology going under the head of Yaakov, is going to now be the line of ideology. And therefore the Seforno says, Vayisnaklu Salam Yisai, it says in the Seforno in source 31, Hine Lashon Nakel Yoreh al Hamtsa'a Lahara. He gives another example. Omar Shechashu Es Yosef Belibam Nuchal Lahamis. They believed Yosef himself was a threat to their own lives. ושבא עליהם לא לדרוש שלומם, אלא למצוא עליהם עלילה או להחטיאם, כדי שיקל עליהם אביהם, או יענישם הקל יספרח, וישאר הוא לבדוי ברוך מבנים, right, he says, לא שנספעל יורה על הציור הדבר בנפש, כמו שאדם מסנקש בנפשי, ונצייר בלבבך מוקש על נפשי. So he says that, what's the threat? When they see Yosef coming, they know that Yosef is already bringing the dibosam ra el aviyam, And they think this is going to be a continuation of that, because Yosef is trying to sublimate them or punish them or diminish them, because they ultimately he wants to be the ideology which is going to rule among the brothers of Yaakov. And skipping along to the period in the fourth line, he says, they were all greatly righteous. Wait a second, all their names are on the breastplate of the Choshen, right? So clearly Hashem thought they were righteous. He says, how could they consolidate and they could make a meeting to kill their brother, to save Etzelim, and they didn't ever actually regret this evil. Do you notice that? Never did the brothers ever regret doing this. He says, later on in Parshas Miketz, where they say we are guilty about our brother, what is the fact? They never said it's because we sold him. He says, or because we tried to kill him. What was the problem? Is we didn't have the natural mercy when we heard him calling out. Meaning it wasn't what we did, it was how we did it. It was that was the concern. And they were concerned about their physical safety, or their spiritual safety, or both of them. And therefore he says, Torah Amra hashkem lahargai. They viewed Yosef as a roidef. Now, by the way, this is a dangerous argument. You have to be very, very careful with this kind of argument, because if you listen to most of the, we'll call it the Arab media today, they're all victims, right? They were defending themselves on October 7th, right? So you have to be very careful with the victim flipping over here. But when we're talking about the greats of our people, the Havdil, and what he's saying over here is there was a thought process. There's a thought process. In fact, Rav Kook has an observation. I'm just going to finish with this, and is that he takes the Seforno to the next step, and he says that in fact the Yosef and Yehuda reflect two ideologies that reflect their mother's ideologies, because there's a Rachel and Leah, which the Zohar says is what's called Alma Diskalia, Alma Diskasia, the hidden world and the revealed world. Which one's which? Who's the revealed world? Who's the hidden world? Rachel is Alma Diskalia. She's the revealed world. That is why she's buried outside the Maras HaMachpelah, Ba'derech, right? Whereas Leah is in the Maras HaMachpelah. That's why we hear about Rachel's appearance. We hear nothing about Leah's appearance except Enei Rakos. That's not about her appearance. That's her eyes, right? So we hear about Yefas Torah, Yefas Mari about Rachel, and therefore they're going to be and that's, by the way, why there was a kitrog of Ateitze Leah, Ateitze Dina Bas Leah, right? The leaving of somebody from that place going out was already not the realm that she should have been in. What is fascinating about this is therefore taking it to the next level. Their Bechorim, their firstborns, Reuven losing his Bechora. Who does that Bechora go to? Yehuda. And Yosef is on Rachel's side. Meaning Yosef is the Bechora of Rachel. Yehuda is the essential, we'll call it now the seat holder of the Bechora of Leah. Therefore, different ideologies. When Yehuda goes down to Mitzrayim, Yehuda shalach lefonav goishna rad laharos to create a ghetto, to create a place to teach Torah before we arrive. Yosef is the one who actually goes ideologically into the lion's den and is able to succeed in the complicated, most difficult, the darkest of places, as long as the Dumus Diyun Koshel Aviv, as long as he has his father's vision in sight of what he wanted from him, which he almost lost himself. And Rav Kook goes on to say, arguing from this Seforno, just to appreciate this, is Yehuda's observation of let's sell him was in fact an ideological concession, which means to say is Yosef believes, and the ideology that we're terrified of is being dominated by a person who says that our nation is going to succeed when out there in the world. We can't. We need insulation. We can't have integration, right? So you know what? Let's do an experiment. Let's sell him and see how he does. That's what Rav Kook says based on the Seforno, right? Which means that was all an experiment. And the question, did the experiment work? Absolutely. Look what he did. He saved the known world. Meaning, Yosef was that. What they were scared of is that Yosef would sublimate the rest of them, that there would be only one ideology, and that would not, most of Klal Yisrael cannot survive with that ideology, right? That was the danger, which is why they felt, Habar lahargo hashkem lahargo. And of course, this reflects a very interesting halachic application, which Rav Kook makes observation, which is that when it comes to the Kochim Kalim, when you eat in the Kochim Kalim, there's a different halacha when it comes to Mishkan Shiloh and the Mikdash in Yerushalayim, of course, Yerushalayim being the capital of Yehuda, and Shiloh being the capital in Har Ephraim, which is of Yosef, the children of Yosef. The split of the kingdom is Yehuda and Yosef, of course, the same Ephraim, Ba'amim Hu Yispolal, right, in the Haftorah, Yechezkel Lamed Zayin, about being integrated into the nations and the danger that comes when it goes too far. But it's interesting, the Kochim Kalim can be eaten in Yerushalayim, but Mitoich HaChoima can only be within the walls, right? Yehuda only operates within the walls. That's why Kochim only exists within the walls. By Yosef, by the Mishkan Shiloh, it is B'chol HaRoyeh, which means that as long as you're within sight distance, that's the Mustin Koshel Aviv, as long as you're within, which is the distance, which is why they found broken pottery in all the surrounding mountaintops adjacent to Shiloh, because that's where they break their pottery they used to cook the korbanos, where before they left Kol HaRoyeh, which is a much further distance, which reflects Yosef's ideology. That comes from the Seforno over here. This is all sort of emerging from this particular Seforno. Very, very fascinating and a very nuanced perspective. Again, it comes from that perspective of pristine appreciation of the greats. We don't necessarily just investigate and academically criticize and have a coffee conversation about people we can't fathom necessarily. And we'll see others disagree, as you even saw the Ramban disagrees. But this is perhaps a little bit of a perspective. I hope this is a little bit of a nuance into one of the great Mefarshim who's found in every Mikras Gedolos essentially. And Mr. Hashem, hopefully we'll be able to opportunity to learn more from